we are on chapter 15, page 167. Huck saves the widow. A widow is a woman whose husband has passed away. So when a husband has died, the wife is called a widow, just so you know. The next morning, the first thing Tom heard was a piece of good news. Becky Thatcher, she's back, who had been on vacation with her family, had just returned. Now, Injun Joe and the treasure sank into secondary importance. So Becky Thatcher, number 1. Injun Joe and the treasure, number 2. And Becky took the chief place in Tom's interest. He saw her, and they spent the afternoon talking and having a wonderful time together. So I guess things have been forgiven. Becky finally got permission to have the picnic she had planned months ago. The invitations were sent out before sunset, and the next day promised to be a treat for every boy and girl in town. Tom's excitement kept him awake until a pretty late hour. Have you ever had that? You're so excited for something, you can't sleep. He had hopes of hearing Huck's signal, but he was disappointed. No signal came that night. By 12 o'clock the next afternoon, everyone was gathered in the Thatcher's yard to set out for the picnic. They boarded a ferry boat and planned to spend the day picnicking on the other side of the river. 3 miles below town, the ferry boat stopped in a wooded cove and tied up. The crowd swarmed ashore, and soon their laughter and shouts could be heard echoing throughout the forest. By and by, somebody shouted, "Who's ready for the cave?" Everybody was. So a cave is like here in this picture. It's really dark inside, and you can explore it. I don't know how to explain a cave, you guys. So everybody was ready to go in the cave. Bundles of candles were collected, and everyone scampered up the hillside to the mouth of the cave. It was an opening shaped like the letter A. The inside of the cave was romantic and mysterious to explore. People said that one could wander days and nights through its intricate chambers and never get out. Nobody knew the cave. That was an impossible thing. Most of the young men knew a portion of it, but nobody ever dared venture beyond this known portion. So Tom knew as little of the cave as anyone did. So the cave is like so big, and there are so many passageways that nobody knows everything about the cave. They know parts of the cave, but nobody knows all of the cave. The crowd filed into the cave and began the exploration. Laughter and shouts echoed from the walls for an hour. Then the clanging of the ferry boat alerted everyone to the time. As the ferry boat's lights came glinting towards the wharf in town, one pair of eyes glanced at them in the cloudy, dark night. Those eyes had been glued to the tavern door for hours, but by now, Huck Finn had just about given up any hope of seeing Injun Joe. So Huck didn't go to the cave. He wasn't invited to the party, maybe. He stayed at the tavern like he promised Tom. He kept looking at the tavern, and it's talking about how all of a sudden there's a pair of eyes that are looking at the ferry boat. So he saw the ferry boat coming back to town. But he stayed at the tavern, or by the tavern. And he hadn't seen Injun Joe yet. Suddenly, a noise fell upon his ear. A noise fell upon his ear. He was all attention. 2 men brushed by him, and one seemed to have something under his arm. It must be the box. So they were going to move the treasure. Why call Tom now? It would take too much time, and the men would get away. Then the treasure would be lost forever. So Huck decided to follow them himself. The men moved up the river street 3 blocks, then turned left up a hill. Huck followed them for what seemed like hours. Soon the men stopped. They were 5 steps away from the path which led to the widow Douglas's house. So that's like saying Mrs. Douglas, but they call her Widow Douglas. I don't know why. Huck crept up behind them and heard a very low voice saying, "Drat, maybe she's got company. I can see lights." The men began to plot and plan. A deadly chill went to Huck's heart. This was the revenge job. Injun Joe still held a grudge against the widow's dead husband, who had been a judge and had Injun Joe horsewhipped as a punishment for vagrancy. So Injun Joe wants to do something to Widow Douglas because her dead husband, when he was alive, he was a judge, and he had Injun Joe horsewhipped. So I think that's like with a whip. Somebody would whip him because of something bad he had done. Now, even though the judge was dead, Injun Joe decided to take his revenge on the old woman. Is that fair? I don't think that's fair. He described horrible tortures he was planning. And as he spoke, he polished his knife. Oh, so he has not nice plans for the Widow Douglas. Huck could hear the evil in his voice. Huck's first thought was to run. Then he remembered that the Widow Douglas had been kind to him more than once. These men were actually planning to murder her. He wanted to warn her, but there was no way to do it without being seen. Holding his breath, Huck silently slipped away and sped to the nearest house. It was the home of Bill Welsh and his sons. Huck banged at the door. "What's going on out there? Who's banging? What do you want?" called Mr. Welsh. Huck breathlessly blurted out the story and begged Mr. Welsh not to tell anyone that it was him who squealed, so him who told. He urged the man and his sons to hurry. 3 minutes later, Mr. Welsh and his sons, all well armed, so they had guns, were at the top of the hill. Huck accompanied them no farther. He hid behind a large boulder, so that's a large rock, and listened. There was a lagging, anxious silence, and then all of a sudden there was an explosion of firearms and a cry, so guns were shooting. Huck didn't wait for anything. He sprang away and sped down the hill as fast as his legs could carry him. At dawn the next morning, Huck returned to the Welsh home. Mr. Welsh and his sons greeted him with a warm welcome and a hearty breakfast, so a really good breakfast. Then he told Huck that the widow had been saved, but the villains had escaped. So the 2 men escaped. That's too bad. So Huck realized that Injun Joe wanted to hurt Widow Douglas, so he ran over to the neighbors and said, "Help! Something's going to happen to Widow Douglas," and he explained what he heard. And so Mr. Welsh and his sons ran over to the house and scared off Injun Joe and the other guy. So one thing that's cool is we learned a little bit more about Huckleberry Finn, right? His first thought was to run when he heard what Injun Joe had in store for the Widow Douglas, but then he realized, oh, she had been nice to me, and they were planning to murder her, so he wanted to warn her, right? So that's something that you could write down, that Huckleberry Finn cares for other people. He's honorable, and he'll do what's right, and you have some evidence right here in this chapter. All right?